Thrown out of a courtroom for daring to speak up, one young man turned injustice into a movement that shook the very foundations of power. What happened next will leave you speechless. On a warm summer morning in a small town in Texas, 17-year-old Marcus Thompson walked confidently into the local courthouse. His crisp white shirt was perfectly pressed, and he carried a leather folder filled with carefully prepared documents. Today was a big day for Marcus. The courthouse was hosting a youth contest aimed at rethinking the justice system, and his project, a bold plan to address systemic inequality, was about to be presented. Marcus wasn't just here to participate, he was ready to make an impact. Inside the courthouse there was a buzz of excitement and nervous anticipation. The judge presiding over the event was Richard Walton, a man known for his sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude. As Marcus entered, Walton's eyes locked onto him. Without even a chance to sit down, the judge barked, "What do you think you're doing here? This isn't a high school hangout." The room went silent. Marcus stood still, confused, as the judge's words hit him like a punch. Despite being a participant in the contest, Marcus was humiliated and escorted out. He stood outside the courthouse, stunned, clutching his folder. But something remarkable happened next. A woman with a phone captured the moment and shared it. Within hours, Marcus's story went viral, sparking outrage across the country. What began as an injustice quickly ignited a fire for change. The following day, as the town was still buzzing from Marcus's story, the courthouse became a focal point for something much bigger than a simple contest. A sea of people, from reporters to community leaders, had gathered outside, demanding answers, holding signs, and chanting for justice. The energy was palpable, as if the very air was charged with the hope of change. Marcus, now standing at the front with his parents, felt a sense of purpose settle over him. It was clear that this was no longer just about him, it was about an entire system that needed to be re-examined. As the crowd outside continued to swell, the courthouse doors swung open and a tall man in a sharp suit entered. His presence alone silenced the room. The man introduced himself as Charles Hunter, a representative from the mayor's office, here to make a crucial announcement. The whispers among the crowd grew louder as they wondered what this could mean. Hunter unfolded a piece of paper, his voice steady as he revealed the news. Effective immediately, this courthouse will have a new director. A hush fell over the room, and then, like a bolt from the blue, the name was announced: Marcus Johnson. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd, shock, disbelief, and then applause. The applause grew louder and more triumphant as Marcus stood wide-eyed in disbelief. His family surrounded him, their faces a mix of pride and joy. This young man, once dismissed, had now earned a chance to make real change, not only for himself but for everyone who had been overlooked and underestimated. Marcus Johnson was now in a position to reshape the future, and his story would inspire generations to come. As Marcus stepped forward to accept his new role, he felt the weight of the moment. His legs were shaky, but he didn't let it show. He knew this was his chance, not just to lead, but to make a real difference. The applause was deafening. With the microphone in his hand, Marcus looked out at the crowd, the reporters, the activists, and the community members who had rallied behind him. His voice, once shaky, now rang out with a new sense of purpose. "This isn't just about me," he began, steadying himself. "This is about all of us. It's about fighting for what's right, even when it feels impossible." He spoke passionately about the need for systemic change, about the inequalities that had plagued the justice system for far too long, and about the importance of accountability. Every word he said carried the weight of his journey, of the struggle he and his family had endured. The crowd listened intently, their faces lit with hope. Marcus's words resonated deeply with them, and by the time he finished, the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation for a young man who had turned his painful experience into a beacon of hope for a brighter future. But just as the crowd's energy reached its peak, the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping across the floor interrupted. As the courthouse buzzed with excitement and applause, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something big had just shifted. He had always known that change was possible, but to see it unfolding before his eyes felt surreal. The room was electric, filled with the energy of a community that had come together for something greater than a competition. It was a movement. As the judges and community leaders discussed the results, Marcus sat in the front row, his hands gripping the edge of his chair, his mind racing. His thoughts briefly drifted to Judge Walton, the man who had tried to silence him just the day before. The judge's storming out of the courtroom had been a defining moment. Marcus couldn't help but feel that it was a sign of defeat. The old ways, the old powers were beginning to crumble. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Stand tall and remind them who you are." And Marcus had done just that. Despite everything that had happened, the event was far from over. As the final announcements were made, Marcus braced himself for what was next. The moment that followed would change the course of his life. But it was never just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed or silenced. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Marcus but for the entire justice system. The future was uncertain, but Marcus was no longer afraid. His journey had just begun. The announcement from Charles Hunter was met with disbelief and overwhelming applause. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to comprehend that he was now the new director of the courthouse, an incredible leap from the young man who had once been dismissed and belittled by Judge Walton. But as he made his way to the stage, the support from his parents and the community washed over him like a tidal wave. His mother, Clara, was in tears, her pride shining through her eyes. His father, Robert, whispered words of encouragement, his voice steady despite the emotion that had clearly taken hold of him. When Marcus stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever felt small, overlooked, or silenced by the system. His voice, though steady, carried the power of every injustice he had witnessed and every fight he had ever endured. He made his promise to work for a more just and equitable system, where everyone's voice mattered, regardless of background. The applause that followed was deafening. Marcus' words had struck a chord, and the community was ready for change. The old guard, embodied in Walton's angered departure, was no match for the force of progress, and Marcus felt the shift within himself. His battle was not over, but the road ahead was filled with hope. As the applause echoed through the courthouse, Marcus stood frozen, disbelief mixed with pride. The moment he had worked so hard for had finally arrived, and he had done it. Not just for himself, but for every voice that had been silenced. His parents, Robert and Clara, beamed with pride. His father's subtle nod was all he needed to know that this victory, though sweet, was only the beginning. Judge Walton, in stark contrast, left the courthouse in frustration, his anger palpable. His hurried exit was not just the result of Marcus's success, but a sign that the system, one that had allowed figures like Walton to hold power unchecked, was beginning to unravel. Marcus wasn't concerned about Walton's reaction. He was focused on what lay ahead, implementing the reforms he'd spoken of. In the days that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly to bring change. He collaborated with local organizations, schools, and law enforcement to promote transparency and fairness. His efforts sparked a movement, one that echoed beyond his small town. Marcus Johnson, once dismissed, had proven that even the smallest voices could spark monumental change. And he wasn't stopping anytime soon.